A flight attendant plunges a pen into the neck of a black CEO at 36,000 feet, an act so shocking it shatters the veneer of luxury and safety in first class. Who was this man, seated in 2A, so calm that even violence couldn't rattle him? What secret forces turned a routine flight into a calculated ambush as cabin lights dimmed and champagne glasses glimmered? Hidden agendas took flight, alliances were revealed, and a covert security team watched every move. Meet Julian Cross, a visionary leader whose silent strength and unwavering dignity transform an assassination attempt into a battle for truth, justice, and systemic change. From the tense exchanges over spilled almonds to the fierce courtroom of public opinion, every moment forces us to ask, how far will power go to silence a single voice, and how loud can quiet courage become when the stakes are sky high? Ready to uncover the full story of sabotage, resilience, and revolution aboard TransLink. Air hit, like, share this video, and subscribe. Now only here will you discover the secrets hidden between these cabin walls. Julian Cross adjusted the cuff of his dark navy suit, letting the sleeve fall just right over his wristwatch. It was an old habit from his days working the floor at his first startup, long before boardrooms and billion-dollar mergers became part of his routine. He stood just inside the TransLink Air private terminal, his carry-on in one hand, the other gently resting in his coat pocket, thumb tapping against his phone not nervously but rhythmically, like he was syncing with something only he could hear. The space was polished but quiet, almost sterile. Gold trim accents along the ceiling, espresso machines whispering in the background, and concierge staff whose smiles were rehearsed but gentle enough not to offend. He had passed through lounges like this dozens of times. Still, something about this one, the silence, maybe, or the way eyes glanced at him and then away again, made the air feel tight in his chest. Julian didn't speak unless spoken to. That was his armor, his method. Silence had never failed him in rooms filled with power or ignorance. It carried further than confrontation and gave him time to read everything and everyone. Behind him, a step or two apart, Desmond Hale stood tall in a steel-gray sport coat. He looked like any other executive passenger, broad-shouldered, early 50s, a whisper of silver at the temples. He never touched his phone unless it buzzed in a particular rhythm known only to him and Julian. Desmond's presence was quiet, but every step, every glance was calculated. Across the room, lounging by the bar in uniform, a younger man shifted his stance. The name tag read K. Royce. He held a tray of champagne flutes with one hand, the other resting stiffly by his hip. He didn't smile. His eyes were locked on Julian longer than a greeting, colder than curiosity. The corners of his mouth twitched, but not into a smile. He blinked and turned, offering the drinks to a group of European businessmen in matching loafers and low murmurs of German-accented English. Julian caught the look, but didn't let it settle on his face. He simply turned toward the hallway leading to Gate 4, where a sleek sign read Flight TL227, Zurich, Elite Lounge boarding now. He moved. Desmond followed. Once past the final gate check, Julian scanned the interior of the jet's elite cabin. Cream leather seating, walnut wood grain trim, and soft white lighting that bathed the cabin in a sense of hushed exclusivity. There were 12 seats in this section, and he was assigned 2A window seat, as always. His team had requested it for one reason: visibility. If anything happened, Desmond would have line of sight, and more importantly, So would Theo Rivera. Theo was already seated 2 rows behind him, posing as a young executive. In reality, he was former Tier 6 security detail with credentials only whispered in defense circles. Theo's warm brown eyes and slightly disheveled hair gave him a disarming presence. You might trust him to babysit your kids before you ever suspected he could neutralize an armed attacker with a coffee stirrer. Julian nodded as he passed Theo. No words, just a look. Theo blinked once in reply. Julian sat in 2A, placing his carry-on beneath the seat and sliding his laptop into his lap. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, then paused. The Wi-Fi hadn't connected yet. He closed the screen, folded his hands, and allowed himself a long, measured breath. He had $1 billion acquisition riding on this flight. If the deal didn't finalize before morning, a competitor would swoop in. His board knew it. The other company's board knew it. But at that moment, what sat heavier in his mind wasn't the deal. It was the look in the eyes of the man carrying the tray. The way Kellen Royce had looked at him wasn't just disrespect. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message. And Julian had received it before in different cities, in different forms. A parking valet that suddenly misplaced his car, a hotel concierge who insisted he wasn't listed on the penthouse reservation, a client's boardroom where he was asked, without irony, if he was with catering. Being a black CEO meant walking into rooms that weren't built for you and pretending the walls weren't watching. As he adjusted his seatbelt, Julian whispered, just loud enough for Desmond to catch, "I felt that." Desmond didn't respond with words. He reached down, tapped once on his smart ring, and looked out the window. The plane doors sealed. A chime sounded, and the pilot welcomed them in a smooth baritone. Passengers in the elite cabin were offered towels. Champagne arrived again. Kellen approached with the tray, now just 3 glasses remaining. He served 2B, then 1A, then stepped right past Julian, not offering anything. The tray tilted slightly. A handful of almonds slid off, scattering across the aisle, several landing near Julian's feet. Julian looked down at them for a moment. He didn't flinch. "Thank you," he said quietly, not looking up. Kellen paused mid-step, just long enough for Julian to notice the tension in his jaw. Then he walked away. Desmond's voice crackled softly over Julian's in-ear comm, barely audible. "We'll monitor. Eyes on every pass." Julian nodded to himself and leaned back, closing his eyes. The plane began to taxi. The engine hum rose from a purr to a growl. Julian felt a small pressure build behind his eyes, not from fear, but from memory. His mind returned to an old conversation with his father. He'd been 17, angry about being passed over for a science fair award despite having the strongest design. His father had said, "Son, there are rooms that'll never applaud you. Walk through them anyway." He exhaled slowly. The plane lifted, and so did the tension. Julian Cross kept his posture relaxed as the plane leveled out above the clouds, but internally. The silence felt louder than it should, the kind of silence that didn't soothe. It scraped, gnawed, asked questions no one wanted to say out loud. From the corner of his eye, he watched the glint of the cabin lights catch the edge of a champagne flute. Kellen Royce was moving methodically through the aisle again, offering drinks to those seated in the elite cabin. His service was robotic, every pore precise, every smile fake. He stopped at seat 1A. A tall man in a beige linen blazer accepted the glass with a nod. Kellen stepped to 1B, another pour, then 2B, the seat directly next to Julian. Julian didn't miss it. The moment Kellen reached the center aisle between 2A and 2B, his posture shifted ever so slightly. The tray tilted not dangerously, but just enough to look careless if someone wasn't paying attention. The champagne glass offered to 2B shimmered under the cabin lights. The man took it. Kellen gave a polite nod. Then his eyes flicked sideways straight at Julian. They locked eyes. There was no smile, no greeting. Kellen didn't offer him a drink. He turned and walked on. Julian's lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. Not yet. Behind him, Theo Rivera sat motionless, but his eyes tracked every movement like a hawk. His fingers were resting on a paperback novel in his lap, but the pages hadn't turned in 15 minutes. Desmond's voice came through the tiny earpiece Julian wore in his left ear. A whisper, smooth as static, intentional. "He skipped you again." Julian replied silently by tapping his index finger once against his armrest. He leaned back into his seat and looked out the window. All he could see was cloud, soft and white, endless. Why now, he thought. Why here? It wasn't that he was shocked by microaggressions. No, those were old friends by now. Sometimes they came in the form of accidental mispronunciations of his name at board meetings. Other times, it was the assumption that he was in the wrong conference room before presentations. But this, on a flight like this, with only a dozen passengers in the elite cabin, this wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. A very specific kind of exclusion. Julian had learned long ago that racism didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered through omissions, through almosts, through the weight of what should have been said but wasn't. He reached down slowly and retrieved a napkin from the seat pocket in front of him. He began gently picking up the almonds that had fallen earlier, one by one, folding them into the napkin with meticulous calm. When he finished, he pressed the call button. Kellen returned, his expression flat. He stopped beside Julian without bending down. Yes, Sir Julian didn't look up at first. He held out the folded napkin. "Your presentation seems to have suffered a structural issue." Kellen blinked. A beat passed before he took the napkin from Julian's hand. "Is there anything else?" Julian looked up then, his voice even, but his eyes unblinking. A simple question. "Do you offer champagne to every elite passenger, or just some?" Kellen's jaw twitched. His voice dropped a register. "Service is discretionary, sir." Julian tilted his head. "Is that right? I thought it was standard for this class." Kellen gave a half shrug that wasn't a shrug at all, just a flex of muscle under skin. "I'll make a note of your concern." He turned and walked away again. Julian didn't press the button again. He simply sat there, hands folded. That was when he felt it, that old tension, like a wire pulled too tight between his ribs, the feeling of knowing you were being watched, tested, calculated. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that at this altitude, some things might stay on the ground. He was wrong. Behind him, Theo was already accessing the aircraft's in-flight network, routing through a secure VPN to Noble Corps' private analytics grid. He began logging timestamps, interactions, faces, patterns. Desmond, 2 rows ahead, typed a short line on his tablet. Engage passive record mode. Upload directly to ArcPoint Cloud. Julian turned his attention toward the window again. But this time, he wasn't seeing clouds. He was watching memories flicker across the glass like film. He was 8 the first time someone accused him of stealing something he hadn't touched. A woman in a grocery store had called security after her purse went missing. It was later found in her own cart, tucked beneath her reusable bags, but the damage was already done. He had never forgotten the look on her face. Like he didn't belong, like he was dangerous by default. He closed his eyes and let the hum of the plane fill his ears. Breathe in. Hold. Exhale. It grounded him. Suddenly, he felt a light tap on his elbow. He turned. It was the woman from 3C. White, maybe late 50s, pearl earrings, a soft lavender scarf looped neatly at her neck. "Excuse me," she whispered gently. "I saw what happened just now." With a drink. Julian studied her face. Her brows were furrowed, lips pressed together. He nodded slowly. "Thank you." She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "You didn't imagine it. I've been on this route a dozen times. I've never seen service handled like that. I'm sorry." He gave a soft smile. "You didn't do anything." "Still," she said, "it's wrong." Julian held her gaze for a moment longer. "Thank you," he said again, more softly this time. The woman returned to her seat, glancing once over her shoulder as she did. Julian reached for his water and took a slow sip. It wasn't about thirst. It was about control, steadiness, the small rituals that helped him stay still when everything else wanted to rise. He pressed the comm again. Desmond's voice returned. "We're logging everything, including passenger witness interactions." Julian nodded. "Good." The cabin dimmed slightly as the flight attendants moved into cruise mode. Julian folded his hands again, resting them in his lap. He knew how this game played out. There were usually two directions from here. One, the microaggressions would escalate. They would prod, provoke, until a reaction came. Then the reaction would be weaponized. Or two, they would disappear. The aggressor would vanish into routine, letting the insult hang unfinished, uncorrected, like a stain no one could see but him. Either way, he'd already made his decision. No outbursts, no scenes, just the truth, documented, delivered, undeniable. As he sat there, breathing quietly, Julian Cross knew something with bone-deep certainty. This wasn't over. The skies had gotten darker, but he was still flying, and he wasn't alone. The seatbelt sign pinged gently overhead, but Julian Cross didn't move. He remained still in his chair, a calm figure in the shifting shadow of cabin lights. Outside the window, the sun had begun to drift lower, casting gold over the clouds like syrup over glass. The hum of the engines was steady, but something just beneath it, felt jagged. He could feel Kellen Royce's footsteps before he heard them. It was an instinct Julian had honed over years in boardrooms and back rooms, high-stakes meetings where tone was currency and silence could be lethal. You learned to sense when someone was circling. Kellen walked past without speaking. He didn't glance at Julian this time, but his energy was electric, pulled tight like a rubber band that might snap. Theo Rivera watched from his seat, eyes hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wasn't reading anymore. The book in his lap hadn't moved. He had his left hand resting against the seat divider, his right gently brushing the inside of his jacket. There were items tucked there, unknown to the average flyer, but nothing that would set off security. He wasn't a brawler, he was precision, and right now he was measuring temperature, and it was rising. Desmond Hale was ahead, seemingly asleep, chin tipped toward his chest, but one eye cracked open just enough to study the reflection in his tablet screen. He saw Julian, saw Kellen's pacing. He made no move. Yet, Julian finally reached for the in-flight tablet built into the side of his armrest. Not for entertainment. He was logging every detail into Noble Corps' encrypted field system. Timestamps, behavior logs, passenger witnesses. The algorithms would sort the patterns later, but he already knew where this was headed. He didn't want to believe it. But he'd been here before. Not this plane. Not this man. But the rhythm of it was the same. It always started with the decision to ignore. Then, a deliberate mistake. Then something just sharp enough to pierce skin, but not sharp enough to leave evidence. Until it did. A few rows behind, a child cried once, then was hushed. The cabin fell back into its hush. Champagne glasses clinked on metal trays, but no one spoke above a whisper. Even luxury, it seemed, had rules about how loudly you could exist. Kellen came back. This time, he carried a tray of folded menus. His demeanor was different. Straighter spine, eyes alert. He passed 1A, then 1B, then 2B. Again, without so much as a flicker of recognition for Julian. Julian slowly extended his hand, stopping him mid-stride. I believe I didn't receive a menu. Kellen turned, eyes cold. It must have been an oversight, sir. So was the drink and the spilled almonds, Julian said, his voice low, calm, but like water, slowly boiling. Kellen's smile was practiced but sharp. Sir, are you accusing me of something? Julian kept his tone level. No. I'm asking if this is how TransLink defines elite service. Kellen's face didn't twitch, but something behind his eyes flashed briefly. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, he stepped slightly closer and placed the menu into Julian's lap. There you go, sir. Julian didn't move. He let the menu sit there, untouched. He looked up instead, eyes steady. You may want to recalibrate your approach. You're carrying more than champagne and peanuts? Kellen leaned closer. Too close. What exactly are you implying? Julian said nothing, just watched him. Theo's voice came softly into the comm, barely a breath. He's baiting. Desmond's signal followed an instant later. Let him. We're rolling. Kellen straightened. His jaw was tight. He stepped away without another word. Julian sat back again, but this time his chest was heavier. Why did it still hit like this? He wasn't new to confrontation. He wasn't a stranger to navigating space where people doubted his presence, his power, his very right to belong. But this wasn't about ego. It was about the old, festering wound of dignity quietly denied, of being treated as invisible when you knew undeniably that you had earned every inch of where you stood. Julian thought about his mother. She had worked 2 jobs to get him through prep school. He remembered how her hands had cracked in winter, how she still smiled through it. Told him, "You let your work speak, let your walk speak. Not your fists, not your pride." He swallowed. Slowly, sometimes, though, the fists curled all on their own. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me." It was Dr. Lillian March, the woman from 3C. She stood beside his seat again, her scarf now draped loose around her shoulders. "I know this isn't my business, but..." That was deliberate. "He's escalating." Julian looked up at her. Her eyes were steady. "It's being documented," he said quietly. She exhaled. "Then I'll document too. If you need a statement, anything when we land, you have mine." "Thank you." She paused, then smiled faintly. "I'm retired now, but I taught ethics and public policy for 27 years. What's happening here isn't subtle, it's surgical." Julian nodded slowly, That's exactly what it is. She returned to her seat. Julian reached for his glass of water again. It had warmed. He took a slow sip anyway. That was when he noticed it. Kellen was back, not with a tray this time. With a notepad, he approached, fast but measured. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice." Julian blinked. "I haven't spoken in 10 minutes. You made a passenger uncomfortable. You threatened me." Desmond stood quietly. He didn't speak, but his height filled the space with presence. Theo stood too. Julian's voice was quiet. "I threatened you." Kellen's eyes were sharp now. The performance begun. "Yes, you implied violence." Julian stayed still. "This is going on the record. Say it again. You implied harm, sir. I'm requesting that you de-escalate or I will call the captain." Theo stepped forward, calmly. Voice low. "Captain should be informed, in fact, because this conversation's being streamed to a federal observer. I suggest you get your supervisor, Mr. Royce." Kellen froze. Something shifted in his eyes. Then he turned and stormed off down the aisle. Julian sat back. His heart was pounding, but his face was still. Theo returned to his seat. Desmond didn't. He stood in the galley area, blocking access just enough to send a message. He was no longer a passive observer. Julian exhaled. He stared out the window again. This wasn't just a hostile encounter anymore. This was a setup, and setups didn't end with apologies. They ended with fallout. Julian Cross didn't flinch when the curtain to the forward galley slid shut. He had watched Kellen disappear behind it only seconds earlier, the fabric flapping slightly in his wake. The noise of the curtain, soft as it was, sounded like a closing door, or maybe something else, a lock clicking into place. Julian exhaled, forcing his shoulders to stay relaxed. Theo Rivera had returned to his seat, but his body was angled just enough that he had a clear view of the curtain. His hand rested on the screen in front of him, but the screen was dark. He wasn't watching a movie. He was listening. Every detail, every shift in the air. Desmond Hale remained standing a few paces away near the galley divider, his pose casual, but every inch of his body said, "I am the line you won't cross." Julian turned his gaze forward. His mind flicked through probabilities. Was Kellen calling the captain now? Was he fabricating an incident? Was he hoping to escalate just enough to remove Julian from the plane, force a delay? Or worse, a scene. There had been other stories. Black professionals escorted off aircraft for refusing to comply. Lawyers questioned. Mothers detained because a flight attendant felt unsafe. And then the media would frame it all with vague, sterile words, an altercation, a disruption, as if dignity could disrupt a flight plan. Julian tapped gently on the armrest. A rhythm. 3 slow knocks. Theo heard it. Desmond, too. It was the pre-code, a shift from observation to precaution. No sudden moves, but eyes open, devices ready. Then the curtain moved again. But it wasn't Kellen who emerged. It was a woman, mid-30s, blonde, pale, eyes wide with discomfort masked under professionalism. She wore a supervisor's pin on her blazer. She approached Julian slowly. "Sir, I'm Claudia Warren, cabin services manager for this flight. May I speak with you privately?" Julian didn't move at first. Is there a reason her voice remained even? But her posture gave her away. Shoulders tight, fingers gripping her tablet too hard. "We've received a report. I'd like to clarify a few things so we can proceed smoothly." Julian smiled gently, the kind of smile that said, I see you, and I see through you. Of course. Let's clarify." She gestured toward the forward galley. Desmond's voice came calmly through Julian's earpiece. "Go ahead. We've got full visual. You're not alone." Julian stood, smoothed his blazer, followed Claudia behind the curtain. The galley was cramped, filled with trays and soft beeping lights. Kellen stood just behind her, arms crossed, his posture smug. Claudia cleared her throat. "Mr. Cross, I've been informed that you refused to comply with basic service interactions, that you used language that made one of our crew members feel unsafe." Julian's expression didn't change. "Would you like to review the footage?" Claudia blinked. "Footage." Julian gestured calmly. "All of my conversations on this flight have been recorded, with time-stamped backups, audio, and visual. My team can provide a full log upon landing." Kellen's jaw twitched. Claudia faltered, then recovered. "Be that as it may, we still need to de-escalate." Julian tilted his head. "Ma'am, I'm seated. I've remained seated. I've not raised my voice, not once, and I've complied with every safety instruction." He leaned forward slightly. "Are you saying your crew is uncomfortable because I asked for equal treatment?" Kellen started to speak, but Claudia raised a hand. "Mr. Cross," Julian cut in, voice still calm, but firmer now. "Do you know who I am?" Claudia paused. "Sir, your name is on the manifest." Julian took a step closer, careful not to be threatening, but his presence filled the narrow space. "I'm Julian Cross, CEO of Noble Core Systems. Our firm designed part of the cybersecurity architecture that TransLink Airlines licenses through third-party vendors. I'm not a man playing games. I am the protocol." The galley fell silent. Kellen's smugness evaporated. Julian took one final breath before finishing. "Now, unless you intend to forcibly remove me from a seat I paid for, I suggest we proceed like professionals. I have documentation, and I have witnesses. And trust me when I say this isn't the hill you want to plant your flag on." Claudia's lips parted, but no words came. Julian stepped back. "I'll be returning to my seat now." And without waiting for approval, he turned and walked through the curtain. Theo's eyes met his instantly. Desmond gave a subtle nod. Julian sat. He took another breath, the air feeling heavier than before. Not just with tension, with something else, something bitter, disappointment. He had hoped this flight might offer peace, time to think, to prepare. But instead, it was turning into a familiar battlefield. "Dr. Lillian March leaned toward him from the row behind. They sent the manager. Julian nodded. She tried to smooth it over. Did she apologize? No. Dr. March sighed. Of course not. Julian leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He was tired, not just physically, but soul deep, the exhaustion that came from having to constantly defend your right to be human. Theo tapped his screen once, signaling that full backup had been created and uploaded. Desmond finally returned to his seat, slow and deliberate. The message had been received. But Julian knew something else now. This wasn't over, because people like Kellen didn't stop at being checked. They escalated. And this time, Julian had seen it in his eyes. There would be retaliation, not with fists, not with shouting, but something smaller, quieter, and that made it more dangerous. He whispered into the comm, voice low, "Monitor every approach. No blind zones, copy." Theo replied. Julian reached for his water again. It tasted like metal now. Outside the window, the sun had dipped just beneath the horizon. The clouds were navy blue, with streaks of gold slowly fading. Dusk in the sky always felt like a metaphor, a line between visibility and shadows. The question was simple. When would the shadows move? Julian Cross sat still for a long time after returning to his seat, the weight of silence pressing against his shoulders like a winter coat. The cabin had settled into its usual rhythm tray tables down, wine glasses refilled, murmurs traveling like low winds down the aisle, but Julian felt none of it. He wasn't in first class anymore. He was somewhere colder, somewhere quieter. It wasn't about a drink, or a menu, or even the manager's lukewarm attempt to settle the air. It was about what came next. He had felt it the moment he passed Kellen in the galley. The man had said nothing, hadn't even looked at him, but his presence had rippled with something cold, something practiced. This wasn't a disgruntled employee having a bad day. It was orchestration. Julian tapped 2 fingers slowly against the armrest, a signal only Desmond and Theo would recognize. Stay close. Prepare for misdirection. The moves were rarely direct in these situations, but the intent always sharp. Desmond was already watching the front cabin monitor through a private lens disguised in his earpiece. His voice came through Julian's comm channel, low and gravelly. Royce is texting, short bursts, looks like code or shorthand, can't confirm target. Julian barely moved his lips. What's the frequency? Desmond replied, almost bored, unsecured, cocky or careless. Julian shook his head, or confident someone's covering for him. Theo's voice came next. Captain's been informed of a security concern in row 2. It was Royce, no direct names yet. Julian's breath slowed. He reached for his phone under the tray table, entered a command string, and encrypted a signal to Noble Corps' remote council team. They needed to be ready, but even as he moved through the motions of control, something inside him shifted. It wasn't fear. He had walked through far worse. It wasn't even anger. That would have been easier. It was a quieter ache. He had boarded this plane hoping to breathe, hoping for stillness. Instead, he was back in the familiar coil of threat and consequence. His mind drifted again. To the night he got his first boardroom seat. He had worn his father's old watch. It didn't match the suit, but he wore it for grounding. And when the chairman congratulated him, calling him a diversity win, Julian had smiled. Not because it felt good, but because his father would have told him, "Son, they can underestimate your presence, but they cannot escape your impact." That thought returned now, softly, like a hymn beneath the tension. The flight attendant cart rolled past. Not Kellen this time, but a younger woman, tall, with tightly braided hair and a nervous smile. She paused at Julian's row. "Would you like dinner?" "Sir," Julian looked at her, then nodded once. "Thank you." She placed a tray down, chicken, rice, vegetables simple, but warm. For a second, Julian let himself smell the rosemary in the sauce. It grounded him. The attendant leaned in, whispering quietly, "I'm sorry about earlier. We're not all like him." Julian looked up, surprised. "Thank you for saying that." She gave a quick nod, then moved on. Desmond's voice returned. March just stood up, heading toward you. Julian didn't need to turn. Seconds later, Dr. Lillian March paused beside his seat again, hands folded in front of her. "Mr. Cross, I just spoke with the gentleman behind me. He said your security guards made him uncomfortable." Julian blinked once. "My guards haven't spoken to anyone but me. I know. That's what made his complaint so strange. Julian tilted his head. Strange how she looked down the aisle, then back. He said Desmond glared at him, but his seat angle doesn't even allow that view. Julian exhaled slowly. It's a build-up. What do you mean? He gestured lightly. Small reports, piling up, paper cuts meant to form a pattern. By the time we land, they'll claim I was aggressive, that my presence created disruption. The story will already be written. Dr. March narrowed her eyes. Do they know who you are? Julian gave a small, dry laugh. Does it matter? She didn't answer, just gently squeezed his shoulder. I've seen this before, in other rooms. I'll stay alert. She walked back. Julian turned to Theo's channel. We may need to initiate phase red. Theo's voice was immediate. I'll prep video push. Full redundancy. Julian leaned back. From the outside, it looked like a quiet flight. But inside the machinery of perception, a different story was already being authored, and Julian Cross was being made into a threat. The captain's voice came over the speaker then, smooth and clipped. Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting light turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten seat belts. Theo's voice followed in Julian's ear. He's stalling. That turbulence warning false flag, meant to lock movement, limit witness exchange. Julian's grip tightened slightly on his tray. That's when Kellen appeared again, not down the aisle, from the other side. He'd looped around through the crew cabin, a shortcut. He didn't carry anything this time. No drinks, no menu, no fake smile. He stepped close, and then he leaned in with an odd, deliberate grace. Sir, you dropped something, before Julian could respond. Kellen reached forward and slid something across the tray table. A folded napkin. Julian frowned. He unfolded it. Inside was a single word, written in jagged red ink, liability. Julian stared at it. Kellen whispered low enough only he could hear. Sometimes it's better to disappear quietly. You're not untouchable. Julian didn't blink, didn't speak. He simply turned the napkin over and wrote one word back, recording. He slid it to Kellen. The color drained from the man's face for just a heartbeat. Then he straightened. This conversation didn't happen. Julian replied, voice cool and composed. Neither did yours. Kellen walked off. Julian leaned back, his pulse thudding now beneath his skin. Desmond whispered, We're seconds away. You good, Julian took a breath. I'm not the target anymore. Theo replied instantly. Then, who is Julian didn't answer right away. He looked down the aisle, at the other passengers, at Dr. March, at the attendant who had apologized. He spoke quietly. Whoever they can spin, whoever they think won't fight back. Theo's voice shifted. Then we protect the whole cabin. Julian closed his eyes, and the silence finally broke. Not from sound, but from certainty. This wasn't a story about an insult, or a drink, or a napkin. It was about the cost of presence, and what some people would do to silence it. The plane trembled gently as it descended into the lower jet stream, the kind of turbulence that felt more like a whisper than a shake. Most passengers didn't notice. Some glanced up from their books, others barely paused their movies. But to Julian Cross, the shift in altitude was anything but routine. It was cover. He knew it. Desmond knew it. Theo confirmed it, his voice low through the comm. Cabin lock just disengaged. Front access door. That's not protocol. Julian's eyes didn't leave the napkin still folded beside his tray table. Liability. That word had echoed in his mind since Kellen Royce slid it over with that smug half grin. It wasn't just a warning. It was a message. A setup. He turned slightly and scanned the aisle. Passengers sat unaware. The hum of the engine wrapped them in the illusion of safety. But illusions were fragile things. Julian murmured into the comm. Scan manifest. Cross-reference crew background. Already on it, Theo said. Desmond added. One of the crew, tall, red-headed male, not listed on the original rotation, no visible name badge. He's been hovering near galley storage. Julian's mind shifted instantly. Plant. No doubt. Desmond was moving now, slowly rising, a stretch to mask the shift. Julian reached for his glass of water, but before lifting it, he tapped 3 times against the tray. The signal was clear. Prepare for intervention. He stood. Sir, the seatbelt light is on, a nearby flight attendant said, her voice tight. Julian turned toward her with quiet composure. I'm aware. I need to speak with the captain. The woman hesitated. Kellen appeared from behind her like smoke, his voice coated in fake concern. Mr. Cross, I'm afraid that's not possible. Julian didn't respond. He simply took 1 step forward, behind him. Theo slid from his seat in a practiced move. Desmond was already rounding the other side, flanking the aisle. It happened so subtly no one outside their trio noticed, except Kellen. He raised his hand. You're making a scene. Julian looked at him. No, you are, and I have 17 minutes of audio proving it. Kellen's eyes darkened. You think you can intimidate your way through policy. Julian's voice dropped to a whisper. I don't need to intimidate. I enforce. He stepped past Kellen, and that's when the red-headed flight attendant moved. Quick, sharp! He lunged from the galley and reached toward Julian's back pocket. Not for a weapon, Julian knew better. It was for his phone, his recordings, the data. Julian spun with surprising speed for a man of his age, catching the attacker's wrist mid-motion. The cabin gasped. Desmond was already on him. 1 swift move and the red-headed man was disarmed of a small metal object, flat, narrow, barely noticeable, a security-grade data scraper, not a weapon, but an eraser. Julian's voice thundered, low and deadly calm. You were about to commit federal tampering on a commercial aircraft. Kellen's face paled. This wasn't a conflict anymore. It was a crime. Theo moved swiftly to the captain's door, flashing a badge that hadn't been visible until now. The seal of the FAA gleamed in the cabin lights. We are assuming oversight. Lockdown protocol effective immediately. Cabin authority is revoked. Gasps echoed. Passengers shifted in their seats. Dr. Lillian March stood up in the first class and addressed those around her with calm authority. Please remain calm. There's a security procedure in place. No one is in danger. Kellen tried to speak, but Julian raised a hand. Don't. You've said enough. Behind them. Desmond held the redhead pinned against the bulkhead, murmuring into his own line. The man wasn't resisting anymore. He knew it was over. Theo returned from the cockpit. Captain's cooperating now. Royce's complaint was preloaded in the system. It was a trap, built to discredit any action you took. Julian nodded slowly. We caught it just in time, but his heart still beat with quiet fury. He looked at the passengers. Some were scared, others were curious, just a few understood. Julian leaned into the comm. Log all footage. Preserve it across cloud redundancies. Full legal relay to Mira and Jalen. Theo's voice was all business. Already sent. Response in 20 minutes. Julian turned to Kellen. Your access is suspended. You can't do that. Kellen hissed. Julian stepped closer. You stabbed me with protocol. You tried to erase evidence. You colluded to incite removal of a seated passenger based on manufactured tension. That's a chain of crimes. And I'm the one man on this aircraft who writes the operational definition of those violations. Kellen's breath caught, and in that moment, he knew. Julian turned back to his seat. He sat slowly, the exhaustion of the last hour pooling at the base of his spine. Not from physical effort, from restraint. He picked up the napkin one last time, folded it gently, then tore it in half and handed one side to Desmond. Evidence, he said softly. Then he reclined, closing his eyes for the first time since boarding. Desmond and Theo flanked him now. They wouldn't rest. Not yet, but they didn't speak. Even Dr. March sat in silence behind him, her face unreadable, hands folded in her lap. Julian's thoughts drifted again. He thought of the press conference that would follow, of the meetings, the calls, the inevitable downplaying from executives, the HR-crafted apologies. But what weighed heavier were the passengers who might never know what really happened, how close they'd come to manipulation, to a story rewritten around them. Julian sighed softly. The silence now was no longer heavy with fear. It was heavy with truth, and that truth had survived the descent. Julian Cross didn't sleep. His eyes remained closed for almost 15 minutes, but rest never came. Instead, a stream of quiet memories passed behind his eyelids, faces he hadn't seen in years. Boardrooms filled with stiff suits and tighter agendas, and his father's voice telling him not to let the room define him. It wasn't trauma that kept him awake. It was presence. His body might have been sitting in first class, but his mind was standing in the courthouse of public judgment, knowing that truth alone was never enough. It had to be documented, repeated, proven, defended again and again, and sometimes, even then, people chose not to believe it. The hum of the engines returned to a steady rhythm. The turbulence, both mechanical and political, had passed. For now. Theo was speaking with the captain behind the curtain. Desmond remained 2 rows behind, arms crossed, eyes scanning with the calm of a man used to chaos. Dr. Lillian March stood slowly and walked to Julian's row. "May I?" Julian opened his eyes and nodded to the empty seat beside him. She sat, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with both hands, a gesture that spoke more of habit than need. "I've seen many things in my career," she began softly. "I've testified in front of panels where I was the only woman in the room. I've taught young men who questioned my qualifications before hearing me speak. But I have never watched a man stay as composed as you did when being intentionally provoked." Julian offered her a faint, grateful smile. "I wasn't always that way." She tilted her head. What changed? He paused, the question lingering like steam on glass. He could have answered with a dozen surface responses. Therapy, experience, age, but he chose honesty. "The first time it happened, I exploded." He said it flatly, with no pride or shame. "I stood up in a meeting after someone made a joke about my tone, and I let them have it. My voice, my history, the microaggressions, all of it. I gave them the full, unfiltered version of myself. And you know what happened, Doctor?" March didn't reply. He answered for her. "They said I was unstable, passionate, but dangerous. I got pulled into HR for communication coaching, and from then on, every board meeting, every panel, I had to wear a mask that said, "I'm calm enough not to scare you." Her voice lowered, and if you didn't, then I'd lose more than my seat. I'd lose the leverage to change anything from it. Silence stretched between them, soft but weighted. She leaned forward slightly. "What keeps you going?" Julian looked toward the window, toward clouds shaped like cities that had never been built, knowing that one day someone like me won't need to carry proof in his pocket to justify his presence. She sat with that. The statement didn't need decoration. It had its own rhythm, its own gravity. After a moment, she asked, "Do you think it will change? Really change?" He considered this, then nodded slowly. "Yes, but not because people will suddenly wake up different. Because people will stop allowing silence to pass for neutrality." Dr. March smiled faintly. "That's a powerful answer." "No," he said, turning toward her. "That's survival." She rested a hand gently on the armrest between them. "I'm glad you survived." Julian met her gaze. "So am I." A soft ding interrupted them. The flight intercom came alive with the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now beginning our initial descent into Washington, D.C. We'll be landing at Reagan National Airport in approximately 25 minutes. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and all tray tables are stowed." Theo returned to the front cabin, leaned slightly toward Julian. "Captain has been cooperative since the override. Kellen's been removed from duty. The plant is restrained, under watch." Julian gave a quiet nod. Press Team Jalen just confirmed press interest. Rafi Solano's already leaked early rumors of an in-flight altercation involving corporate figures. Julian closed his eyes briefly. "They're going to spin this." "Of course," Theo said, "but we'll outspin them with truth." Julian didn't believe in revenge. He believed in clarity. It wasn't about making Royce or the others pay. It was about making sure the narrative didn't wash away what had happened like a chalkboard in rain. As the aircraft tilted slightly and began its descent, a woman across the aisle suddenly stood. She was elderly, maybe in her late 70s, with white curls and sharp blue eyes. She wore a soft beige cardigan and held a cane. She stepped carefully to Julian's row and leaned in just enough for him to hear. "I saw what happened. I didn't say anything. I was scared that it would turn into something ugly, that they'd target me too." Julian looked up at her gently. "You don't need to explain." "No, I do," she insisted. "I just wanted you to know your silence wasn't weakness. It was thunder, just quiet thunder." Julian's throat tightened. "Thank you." She smiled and added something that would stay with him longer than any legal statement. "You made me braver, son." She returned to her seat. Julian sat very still, eyes stinging slightly, not from shame, but from the strange ache that comes when you're seen not as a symbol, but as a human being. The descent continued. Below them, the lights of the Capitol began to sparkle like scattered stories waiting to be told. Somewhere beneath those clouds, cameras were warming up, headlines were being drafted, and agendas were shifting. Julian Cross didn't know what the evening news would say, but he knew what he would say when the microphones came. He would tell the truth, and he would do it without raising his voice, because sometimes dignity was the loudest response of all. The wheels met the runway with a soft thud, and a rush of deceleration that swept through the cabin like the closing of a book. For a moment, there was stillness, the collective breath of hundreds held somewhere between relief and expectation. Julian Cross sat motionless, eyes fixed on the seat back in front of him, not out of fear or fatigue, but because he knew the next moment was no longer private. The moment they taxied to a full stop, the story wouldn't belong to him anymore. It would belong to headlines, to commentators, to people who hadn't seen what he saw or heard what he heard, and yet they would have opinions, loud ones. The plane slowed, the flaps shifted, the captain's voice came over the speaker again. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Reagan National Airport. For security purposes, please remain seated until instructed. Thank you for your cooperation during an unusual journey. We will be grounded for a few minutes while a special operations team boards to conduct a routine inspection." Routine. Julian nearly smiled at the word. Nothing about this had been routine. Theo leaned across the aisle. "Ground team's ready. FBI liaison is en route. We'll have legal presence within the hour. Mira's waiting with Jalen at gate 42. Julian nodded, his voice quiet. Good. Desmond hadn't spoken much since the incident. He was watching the back of the plane like a hawk, already aware that attention could shift at any moment. His hand rested near his coat pocket. Calm, unthreatening, but ready. Passengers were starting to murmur again. Whispers darted across rows like notes in a classroom. Dr. Lillian March was already on her phone, discreetly typing, likely documenting everything she had seen. Julian turned and looked out the window. D.C. Lights shimmered beyond the glass. Somewhere out there was a podium, a press conference, a narrative waiting to be owned or lost. A small voice cut through his thoughts. "Excuse me." Sir Julian turned. It was a boy, maybe 10 or 11, seated across the aisle with his mother. He had curly black hair, large brown eyes, and a wrinkled marvel hoodie. His hands gripped a sketch pad that looked worn at the edges. The boy leaned forward. Are you a superhero or something?" Julian blinked. His mother, flustered, reached for the boy's arm. "Micah, no, don't bother the man." But Julian raised his hand gently. "It's okay." He looked at the boy with a soft smile. "What makes you think I'm a superhero?" The boy hesitated, then flipped open his sketch pad. It showed a crude but heartfelt drawing of a man standing up in front of a crowd, shielding a group of people behind him. The man wore a suit and a mask not to hide his identity, but, like armor, below it, in pencil, were the words "Strength without shouting." Julian's throat tightened. He looked at the boy again, who shrugged bashfully. "I just thought maybe you were." Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out his business card. Not for publicity, but because he knew what it meant to be seen as more than a problem. "That's yours now," he said softly. "And if anyone ever tells you that strength has to be loud to be real, you tell them you met someone who showed you otherwise." The boy grinned. His mother mouthed, "Thank you." Then came the knock, not on the door, but at the front bulkhead, sharp, polite, firm. The cabin door opened. 4 individuals entered, 2 in plain dark suits, 1 in a recognizable TSA uniform, and the 4th, a woman with graying braids and a steel clipboard. Her badge bore the seal of the FAA and the Department of Justice. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week and didn't intend to. Julian stood before they reached him. "Agent Camille Monroe," she introduced. "I'm assuming interim oversight per federal directive." Julian extended his hand. Julian Cross. You'll find all supporting documentation has already been uploaded to our secure legal cloud. She nodded once. We've reviewed it. Our team's already taken the compromised crew member into custody. He's being processed now. Kellen Royce, temporarily detained, refuses counsel, refuses to speak, clearly knows more than he's letting on. Julian exhaled slowly. Of course, Agent Monroe stepped aside. We'd like to escort you and your team directly to Gate 42. Your legal and press representatives are waiting. You will not be speaking to any unauthorized personnel during transfer. Standard containment until briefing. Julian nodded. What about the passengers? We're rotating, deboarding. Witness statements will be collected voluntarily, starting with your section. Full confidentiality promised. Julian turned to Dr. March, who was already standing. I'll testify, she said, before anyone asked. The elderly woman with white curls from earlier was beside her. So will I, one by one. Others stood, not all, but enough. Enough to show that silence hadn't won. Julian walked slowly down the aisle, flanked by Theo and Desmond. Each step felt heavier now, not from fear but from the weight of truth carried openly. From the moment he left the aircraft, his words would not belong to him alone. They would be dissected, challenged, spun, but they would still be his. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Julian paused. He turned back to look at the plane, the narrow aisles, the folding tray tables, the cabin that had tried to contain his story. Then he turned forward again and walked into the storm, unafraid. The conference room at Gate 42 was nothing more than a repurposed airport lounge, frosted glass walls, a long, oval table, and the buzz of fluorescent lights that made everything feel 2 shades colder. But the room's simplicity belied the intensity that had filled it within seconds of Julian Cross stepping inside. Mira Caldwell stood by the corner, tablet in hand, her sharp eyes already parsing 3 live news feeds at once. Her gray suit was creased at the elbow, not from carelessness, but from hours of leaning into the fight. Jalen Ford was seated with a legal pad open, his pen tapping rhythmically as if pacing through legal arguments in his head. The moment Julian entered, they both stood. "We're good to proceed," Jalen said. 3 networks have confirmed footage from the flight has already leaked. We don't know by who. It doesn't matter who. Mira added, "It's out 2 minutes ago. A clip hit social media, just audio, but enough to hear Kellen's voice during the incident." Julian lowered his coat onto the back of the nearest chair. "The part where he screams, 'You people always act entitled.'" Mira nodded. Trending under the hashtag #FirstClassRage, Theo and Desmond entered quietly behind him, taking flanking positions by the door without a word. They didn't need instructions, not anymore. Julian looked at the wall of screens on the side table. One showed a news crawl breaking black CEO involved in mid-flight incident. Another had muted footage of the tarmac from earlier that morning. No arrests had been announced yet, but the storm was already flooding timelines. "What's the strategy?" he asked, settling into the chair at the head of the table. Jalen opened his folder. "We don't lead with blame. We lead with clarity. You recount the facts calmly. You emphasize that the situation was handled according to federal protocol. You speak about the safety of all passengers, not just your own violation. And when they ask if it was racially motivated, you say, 'The footage speaks for itself. But I encourage the public to consider why incidents like this happen repeatedly, and to whom.'" Julian nodded once. It was the right move. Not the satisfying one, but the wise one. Mira leaned in slightly, her tone lowering. The CEO of TransLink Air, Silas Trent, just issued a preliminary statement. Wants to distance the airline from Kellen Royce, calls him a rogue employee, and said, and I quote, "This unfortunate behavior does not represent our values." Julian chuckled under his breath. Translation, they didn't expect to be caught on camera. Mira didn't laugh. Her voice became even colder. We also intercepted a legal memo. There was a plant on the flight, red-headed male, seat 3B, not on the manifest, not cleared for first class, likely embedded by an internal rival to bait or discredit you, possibly linked to the board's dissident faction. Julian's expression darkened. That explains the tension. He kept watching me. Theo nodded. I clocked him. Kept shifting his phone toward you like he was filming discreetly. But I didn't have authority to intervene until the attack. Desmond added quietly, and then it was too late. Julian rubbed his temples. They sent someone to provoke me, to record the reaction, to push me off balance, but they didn't count on someone like Kellen making it worse. Jalen closed his folder. They didn't expect you to stay composed. Julian looked around the room, his team, his allies, the space now functioning as their war room. And yet, his mind wasn't on the press or the executives or even the threat to his reputation. It was on the boy, Micah, his sketchbook. The words scribbled beneath a drawing, strength without shouting. He couldn't let that boy see him lose control now, not when the world was finally listening. Agent Camille Monroe entered then, calm and unhurried. She wore the same dark suit from earlier, but her badge now hung around her neck plainly. "We've secured custody of the redhead," she announced. "No ID, prepaid burner phone, encrypted chat app installed." He lawyered up the moment we asked about motives. "Won't speak?" "Not yet." Julian raised his eyebrows. "Not yet." She gave a grim smile. "He's scared, which means we're close." Mira gestured toward one of the screens where a new Chiron appeared. CEO Julian Cross to speak at 7 p.m. Eastern. "It's time," she said softly. Julian stood slowly, as if rising carried the weight of every word he would soon speak. The press conference podium had been set up in a reserved concourse corner, draped in navy blue with the seal of the Department of Transportation overhead. Cameras were already positioned. Reporters swarmed behind the line, holding phones, mics, and tablets. Julian walked toward the podium alone. Behind him stood a team, but ahead of him waited a world that wasn't just hungry for answers. It was hungry to decide. He cleared his throat. "Good evening." The microphones lit red. "My name is Julian Cross. I'm the CEO of Meridian Holdings. But more importantly, I am a citizen, a father, a passenger like any of you." He paused. "Today, I experienced an act of aggression that wasn't just about me. It was about power. It was about identity. It was about how easy it still is, in some places, to see someone like me as a threat instead of a human being." He let the silence settle. I did not raise my voice. I did not retaliate. I did not seek vengeance. I sought safety, and I will always seek truth. He turned his gaze slowly across the press pool. "Many of you will analyze this incident in political terms, corporate terms, legal terms. That's fine. But please, don't forget the personal terms, because somewhere on that plane was a child who watched all of this unfold. And when he asked if I was a superhero, I didn't know what to say. He swallowed, then added quietly, "But I knew I wanted to be the kind of man he could still believe in afterward. And that, more than anything, is why I'm standing here. No further questions." He stepped back from the mic and left the podium. The cameras kept rolling. The reporters shouted names and queries and demands. Julian kept walking. He didn't have to shout to be heard. He had already spoken in the only language power respects: presence. The elevator rose in complete silence. The only sound was the faint hum of its ascent and the subtle creak of Desmond's shoulder holster shifting as he adjusted his stance. Theo stood slightly in front, his eyes fixed on the digital floor numbers above the steel doors. 28, 29, 30. Julian Cross didn't look up. His gaze was locked on his reflection in the polished chrome wall across from him. The man staring back wasn't tired. He wasn't angry. He wasn't victorious. He was measured, the kind of calm that scared people more than rage ever could. When the elevator doors opened, Mira was already waiting in the executive lobby. Her arms were crossed, but her expression was unreadable. They're inside. Full board. No legal counsel yet. They didn't expect you to arrive this soon? Perfect, Julian said. He walked forward with the deliberate pace of a man who knew exactly how long his silence could unnerve a room. Theo and Desmond followed, but paused just outside the frosted glass door that led to the main conference chamber, what Julian often referred to privately as the mirror room. Because in this room, no one ever revealed who they were. They simply reflected what power demanded of them. Julian stepped inside. The board of Meridian Holdings sat around the sleek obsidian table. 11 men and women, some longtime allies, some quiet rivals, and a few whose ambition barely fit in their tailored suits. At the head sat Alan Wexler, interim board chair, and a man whose handshake always felt just 1 degree too firm. Julian said nothing at first. He simply pulled the chair at the opposite end of the table and sat, his hands folded neatly. Wexler cleared his throat. "Julian, we were just reviewing the statement you gave to the press. You mean the one I was forced to give after being attacked at 36,000 feet. A few board members shifted in their seats. Julian didn't blink. Let's skip the performance. You knew there was a setup. One of you greenlit it." Alan raised his hands. "That's a serious accusation." "No." Julian's voice was level. "A serious accusation is what happens when you stab a man with a pen in front of a full cabin. What I'm doing is stating facts." Another board member, a woman with ice-blonde hair and thin-rimmed glasses, spoke up. "You're suggesting we orchestrated the incident. I'm suggesting someone in this room authorized a shadow operation that involved planting a provocateur, triggering an escalation, and possibly destroying this company's reputation in the process." Julian reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single printed frame, paused footage from leaked in-flight video. It showed the red-headed man in 3B, holding his phone, angled toward Julian's seat. He slid the paper across the table. He wasn't on the first-class manifest. No known ID. Security badge didn't scan properly. Burn phone. Ties to someone with access to our executive travel schedules. Julian looked directly at Wexler. "I don't need proof of motive. I already have a confession." A beat of silence passed before Wexler responded. "You think I wanted to sabotage you? I think you wanted to own the fall before I could frame the recovery. There's a difference." Julian leaned back in his chair. He could feel the familiar tug of his temper, that sharp ember that longed to rise but he pushed it down. He had taught himself long ago that power didn't shout, it waited, it chose its words, and it always spoke last. The boardroom fell quiet again. Then came a voice Julian hadn't expected. Tobias Grant, the general counsel of Meridian Holdings. He'd been absent during the press events, supposedly tied up in a separate compliance issue, but now he stood in the doorway, having entered unnoticed. That redhead in 3B, I ran a trace. He's connected to Caden Worth. The name hit the room like a dropped glass. Julian slowly sat forward. Caden Worth. Tobias nodded. Former COO of TransLink. Pushed out during the merger you negotiated. He lost everything when you restructured the regional subsidiaries. Julian narrowed his eyes. That was 4 years ago. He's been building quiet alliances ever since. My sources say he's been in contact with more than one person in this room. All eyes turned toward Wexler. Julian's voice dropped to a near whisper. So that's what this was. Revenge wrapped in a business strategy. Wexler didn't deny it. Instead, he offered a different kind of smile, the weary kind. You changed the rules, Julian. You brought in your own people, enforced quotas on legacy contracts, audited departments no one had touched in years, and now you act surprised there's pushback. Julian stood. Pushback is when you write a memo. Or call for a vote. Not when you send a man onto a flight to provoke a federal incident. He looked at each board member in turn. This company doesn't just sell services. It sells trust. To governments, to communities, to people like the kid I met today who wanted to know if I was a superhero. And what did you tell him? Someone asked. Julian turned toward the voice. I told him I was trying to be. Silence. Then Tobias spoke again. FAA is launching a full investigation into the attack. The DOJ has joined the inquiry, and Internal Affairs will be questioning everyone involved in the unauthorized data access that enabled the plant's boarding. Julian faced the board one final time. You all have until tomorrow to submit full statements. Anyone found withholding information will be terminated with cause. That includes board members. He paused. And as of this moment, I'm reinstating my emergency executive authority under Clause 12.3 of the Charter. The board is suspended from voting rights for 14 days pending full review. A collective gasp moved through the room. Wexler stood. You can't do that. Julian's eyes were cold. Watch me. Then he walked out of the mirror room. He didn't slam the door. He didn't need to. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the temporary operations center, painting the rows of monitors and whiteboards in a warm glow that belied the tension inside. Julian Cross sat at the head of the makeshift table, the same polished obsidian surface that had once been the mirror room's altar to power. Now it was his command center. He studied the map projected on the central screen, a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and coded transfers linking Altura Net Group, Cinderite Holdings, and a network of dormant subsidiaries. Theo Rivera hovered over the data feed, fingers moving faster than thought, tagging nodes and isolating IP addresses. Desmond Hale stood by the door, quietly observing logistics personnel who were preparing secure devices and drafting rapid response protocols. Mira Caldwell cleared her throat, breaking Julian's focus. We have confirmation from DOJ Cyber Division. They've traced the red-headed plant's burner phone to a safe house 2 blocks from TransLink Air's former HR headquarters. The DOJ is preparing a raid. Julian nodded. Good. That takes care of the supply chain. Tobias Grant leaned forward, tapping his pen against a notepad. I've drafted emergency shareholder communications. We can release a limited notice, Meridian Holdings actively cooperating with federal authorities to address a malicious sabotage attempt. It positions us as transparent and proactive. Julian shook his head. Too passive. We need firebreak, not spin. We need decisive action that stops the next phase before it starts. Theo glanced up. We found chatter on the dark web, references to Phase 2 targeting minority-led ventures in renewable energy. Dates and times align with upcoming MergerCon conference in Boston. The room fell silent. MergerCon was next week an event where Julian would announce a multi-billion strategic partnership. If Phase 2 succeeded, they'd not only disrupt his deal but weaponize a tragedy for headlines. Julian stood. His voice was steady, but the undercurrent was steel. We strike first. We publicly call out Cinderite and their backers. We release all leaked docs, files, audit reports, including the Nightfall Doctrine. We expose their entire blueprint for sabotage. Mira's eyes widened. That memo, do we really want that out in the open? It names CEOs, board members, private equity firms. Julian drew in a slow breath. Yes, it's time the world sees the full framework. No more half measures. Desmond spoke quietly. Operational security says we verify secondary sources first. We can't risk counterclaims of forgery. Theo nodded. I've got backups, whistleblower audio, internal emails. We can certify authenticity and notarize the documents within hours. Julian let the idea settle. A pause, a breath. Do it. Mira immediately tapped commands into her tablet. Preparing secure drop to every major media outlet. Deadline in 2 hours. Tobias looked uneasy. And the stock reaction. We're burning them now. That's going to tank market value overnight. Julian met Tobias's gaze. Better here than later. If we wait, their next move could be even worse, someone dead. Operations halted. Financial catastrophe. I'd rather absorb the hit than watch legacy systems crush everything. The board has 48 hours to troubleshoot. Tobias. Then I'll recommend new leadership, possibly new ownership. Tobias exhaled. This was hardly a victory for him personally, but he didn't argue further. Julian turned to Theo. Notify our allies in the Vanguard Circle. We need a unified statement condemning Nightfall tactics and reaffirming our commitment to equity in business. Let them know we're building a coalition to monitor and protect minority executives. Theo keyed in the message. Already sent to Grace Lee, Marcus Vargas, Layla Ahmed, and 8 others. Desmond tapped his comm. Security detail has been beefed up for your upcoming appearances. We'll rotate safe rooms for each event. Julian nodded. Good. Now, how am I feeling? Silence. No one answered. Not out of disrespect, they knew better than to speak until spoken to. Julian closed his eyes briefly. I'm harsher than I wanted to be. I'm wielding this pain like a weapon, but maybe that's necessary. He opened his eyes. I need to know I'm still me under all this, not just a CEO, not just a symbol, a human being. And if this goes south, if the backlash is worse, if they accuse us of defamation or fabricating evidence, can I still look myself in the mirror? Mira stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. You're doing what few would. You're turning a personal attack into a public reckoning. That takes courage, not cruelty. Julian gave a half smile. Thanks for the pep talk. I'll need more before tomorrow. Mira nodded once. Then she went back to drafting the statement. Julian took a moment to breathe. He stared at the map of threats on the screen. the tangled lines and red dots marking known conspirators. Each dot represented a person, some faceless, some with names he recognized from past negotiations. He thought of their faces, Alan Wexler's steel-blue gaze as he tried to bargain away the company, Caden Worth's smug expression when he was forced out, the anonymous banker who facilitated payments. Each one had believed they could control the narrative. He thought of Julian the teenager, the one who had learned to code behind his father's garage, whose only weapon was his voice and his vision. That boy had never wanted to break things. He wanted to build. Had he lost that? Was he still building? Or now just leaving wreckage? He tapped his finger on the glass tabletop. A quiet staccato. He could feel Desmond and Theo watching him, waiting, supporting. They weren't just security. They were reminders of why he did this to protect not only himself, but every person who believed in him. He stood, straightened his jacket. All right. He addressed the room. Let's light the fire break. Release everything. Full transparency. Then we defend. Then we rebuild. You wanted action. Julian, Mira said softly. Now you have it. He nodded. Let's burn out the rot. As the operations center came alive, legal teams finalizing memos, cybersecurity specialists initiating encrypted drops, media liaisons crafting headlines, Julian took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in the hush before the storm, he allowed himself to remember the boy with the sketch pad. Strength without shouting. He opened his eyes. This was the loudest quiet he could imagine, and the world would have to listen. Julian Cross stepped out of the operations center and into the early morning light that filtered through the terminal windows. The air tasted of coffee and jet fuel, of endings and beginnings. Behind him, the war room hummed with subdued activity teams finalizing press releases, mapping next steps, checking flight schedules for security. Ahead of him lay the world he had reshaped with truth, strategy, and resolve. He paused beside a row of empty seats, the ones where Micah had sketched at the window. Julian touched the seat back lightly, as if greeting an old friend. A boy's innocent question had reminded him that strength was more than power. It was purpose carried silently, firmly, without spectacle. His phone buzzed. A message from Rafi Solano headline, "Looks good. CEO Cross leads transparency, crackdown on corporate sabotage. Early analytics trending." Julian allowed himself a small, hollow smile. Headlines came and went. It was hearts and minds he truly needed to reach. Desmond Hale approached, hand on Julian's shoulder in that steady way that said, "I've got you." Theo Rivera followed, earbuds tucked away, eyes alert for any new threat. They flanked him as they had throughout the crisis. Bodyguards, yes, more than that, anchors to reality. "We're clear to move toward the VIP shuttle," Desmond said quietly. "You have a midday meeting with the Department of Transportation. They want your input on new executive travel safeguards." Julian nodded. The invitation was no courtesy. It was recognition that his story had changed policy, that his presence had reframed safety not as privilege but as basic human right. As they walked, Mira Caldwell fell in step beside him, tablet in hand. She glanced at him and said, "Media is already asking about the secondary leak. They want to know who inside Meridian facilitated the exposure of the Nightfall Doctrine." Julian drew a slow breath. The final betrayer, the silent conspirator who had sold integrity for personal gain. "We'll name them all. Mira," he said softly. "Every last one who conspired to harm me or wreck this company, If we spare anyone, the pattern continues, so we show consequences." Mira nodded. She had already arranged for the board suspensions. A full audit of every seat assignment, email chain, travel manifest. Nothing would remain hidden. They crossed the terminal lobby and joined a small group led by Agent Camille Monroe. Cameras flashed. Reporters called his name, but Julian didn't pause. He strode toward the black SUV marked DOT Official Transport. The vehicle's door opened, and he slid inside. Theo and Desmond closed ranks around him. Mira climbed in beside him. Tablet balanced on her lap like a shield. Agent Monroe took the front passenger seat. The door shut with a soft click. Inside the SUV, the world cursorily continued. A journalist's voice asked, "Mr. Cross, do you feel you're safe now?" A camera light blinked. Julian held up a hand. "No comment," he said. He wasn't ready to sound bites. He needed measured words that would build lasting change. The vehicle moved. Engines purred. They passed shops and passengers hustling to flights, a world in constant motion. Julian leaned his head back, eyes closed. He thought of fire breaks, coalition pacts, protective legislation. They were all steps, means to ensure what happened on Flight TL-227 never happened again. Then he thought of Micah's draw on the man standing firm before a crowd, strength without shouting. That remained his lodestar. Minutes later, the SUV pulled up to the Department of Transportation building, a modest glass facade that contrasted with the terminal's grandeur. He stepped out onto the curb. A small cluster of DOT staff waited inside. Cameras and officials, but no stage. This was policy work, not performance. Inside, the undersecretary shook his hand. "Thank you for coming. Julian, your testimony this morning was powerful. I appreciate the invitation." Julian replied, "But this isn't about me. It's about finding solutions." They walked down marble corridors. Each step echoed with history. Regulations passed, rules rewritten, safety mandates conceived. Today, Julian would add his chapter. The conference room overlooked the Potomac. Windows captured the river's steady flow, symbolic of time moving forward. He took his seat at the round table. Around him, civil servants, legislative aides, transportation experts, a few invited minority-led business leaders. The undersecretary nodded and began. "We've drafted a preliminary framework for mandatory psychological screenings for first-class crew, bias training certified by independent bodies, and random security audits of executive travel files. But we need your perspective." Julian listened, then spoke with quiet conviction. "Screenings and audits are necessary, but they must be enforced by an independent council. No airline should police itself alone, and bias training must be ongoing, not a one-time checkbox. It should include passenger feedback, anonymous reporting channels, and real-time monitoring." He paused. Finally, "I propose a unified Executive Protection Act, a coalition of airlines, regulators, and independent experts to share best practices, real-time threat intelligence, and transparent incident reporting, open data for research, public accountability. That way, everyone flies safer, and no one's story can be quietly erased." The room absorbed his words. Eyes shifted. Motes of sunlight flickered on attentive faces. The undersecretary nodded. "We'll draft legislation. We'd like to name you honorary co-chair of the council." Julian's chest tightened. Honorary, but it meant real work. He nodded. "I'll serve." As the meeting progressed, Julian felt the tight coil of tension begin to unwind. Not completely. There was still fallout to manage, lawsuits to oversee, stock volatility to address, but the core fight had shifted from survival to progress. Afterward, as he exited the building, Julian paused on the steps. Below him, the river sparkled in midday sun. A new chapter awaited. His phone buzzed again. A message from Micah's mother. "Thank you, sir. You keep your promise. Safe travels." He smiled. He typed back, "Thank you, Micah, for reminding me why." As he reached his car, Desmond and Theo flanked him once more. They exchanged glances. Mission accomplished, but vigilance unwavering. Julian slipped into the back seat. Theo closed the door. The driver navigated toward the city streets. Julian allowed himself a final moment of reflection. He thought of every person affected: the young flight attendant who had apologized, the witnesses who came forward, the whistleblowers who risked everything. Their collective courage had ignited this movement. He thought of his father's words once more. Walk through those rooms anyway. He had done more than walk. He had forced the rooms to change. Strength without shouting. The SUV rolled on, crossing the bridge back toward the city's heart. Ahead lay board meetings, coalition gatherings, legislative hearings, and the promise of safer skies. Julian pressed his fingers lightly to the badge clipped to his lapel, a simple meridian emblem now worn more like a shield than a status marker. He closed his eyes, and in that brief darkness, he saw possibilities. Real, tangible change fashioned from personal trial, a new horizon stretching beyond corporate lines, beyond headlines and hashtags, straight into everyday life. Because sometimes survival was only the start.